Hi. So sorry about that. My name is James Kyle. I'm an open source developer. I work on a lot of front-end tooling. You might know like Babel and Flow and Lerna and all these different things. But yeah. So you know how you're probably thinking, yeah, I'm getting the hang of state in React. I have my Redux stuff, and everyone seems to be using that. And finally, all this churn in the JavaScript ecosystem is starting to slow down. So I did a thing. Stay with you, okay? Unstated is a new library that I released last week. It's only about 100 lines of code. You can probably read it faster than I can give this talk. I think it's pretty good, you know, but you're allowed to disagree with that. But let me explain it to you. Let's imagine an app. Our app, it's pretty simple. Just a counter with buttons for incrementing and decrementing that number. Exciting stuff. This is what they pay me the big bucks for. When you click on the button, the count increases by 1. When you click the other button, it decreases by 1. Good night. Let's imagine how that would look in a React component. I'm assuming you're all familiar with this thing called React. This is the full component right here. We have our state, which is just that count. We have our methods for incrementing and decrementing that count. And then we just have some code for rendering our state into UI and binding events to the buttons. Cool. So what we have now is already really great. Our state lives on our component and it works really well. We can easily predict how it's going to behave. We can easily test it in isolation and make sure that it's doing what we expect. And most importantly, it's really easy for us to read and understand. Looking at this component, even if you're brand new to React, just by scanning over the code, you can get a decent understanding of what its purpose is. It follows some pretty nice conventions. The problem comes when we have to share state between our components. This is where libraries like Flux and Redux come in, and we start having these really deep conversations about how we model the entire universe. But let's back up from all of that and go back to the core question of how do we share state between components in React? Well, how do we share anything in React? Context. Come on, yeah, there we go. Right, through context. So here I'm actually using that new React Create Context API that was mentioned before. If you missed it, there was recently a proposal to change the API for context to make it easier to work with and also like typable if you use a type system. And the basic idea here is that we create two components, a provider and a consumer, where we can pass some state into the provider and it ends up in the consumer without explicitly passing it through the tree. And this means that no matter how deep in the tree your component is, as long as it is inside the provider, the consumer will receive the state and update as it does. You'll also notice that we're using this new cool pattern that everyone's talking about called render props or functions as children, which is great in a lot of ways, but I won't get into that now. There is some new docs on the React website about it. Might want to check those out. So context is great. It enables sharing state through the tree in a very painless way. So how can we take advantage of the good parts of component state and the good parts of context and share our state in our app? Well, this is where my idea for Unstated came from. So let's go back to our counter component from before. Now, I already think this component is perfect. A lot of people think that component state is evil for some reason and that you should like abstract it into this like mess of reducers and actions, but like this makes sense. Like we get it, and it works, and like we don't need this to hot reload to build it. It works. But yeah, and you should use this pattern until you can't for some reason. You shouldn't try abstracting all component state away. I'm not suggesting you do that with Unstated either. But let's imagine that we wanted to take our counter state and share it with something else in our app, Unstated adds this idea of containers. Containers look a lot like components, but they're just for state, and they don't render anything. They don't have component will mount, they don't have render, they don't have any of those things. They just have the state and set state. And so what we do is we pull our component state into a container, and we're literally just going to cut and paste our state and the methods into a new class, which looks like this. You can see we're just deleting the render, and we're renaming it to extend from this container class instead of a component. Now, containers are very simple objects, and you can create instances of them yourself. You don't need to use React even. This makes testing really easy because it just works like any other class in JavaScript. You can just instantiate it and then just start asserting things about it and call methods on it. The next piece is going to be subscribers. A subscriber is just a component which accepts a to prop, which you can pass your container class to. And note that we're passing the reference to the class itself and not an instance of the class. This is going to get important later. Inside of our subscribe component, we're going to pass a function as its children, and that function will receive an instance of our class. Internally, Unstated creates its own instances of these containers. Now our counter component looks like this. Notice that we can just use the function component and just write our render method. Inside of the subscribe element, we can reference the instance of our container and pass methods to on the class as event handlers and reference things on its state. The last piece that we need, which is really simple, is the provider component. And all we need to do is wrap our app in a provider component and we're done. Just like that. Internally, provider is a piece of Unstated which holds all of the instance of your containers, but it gets a little bit cooler than that. Provider has a sweet prop called inject, where we can pass our own instances of containers in. You might be wondering why you might want to do that. It's really great for testing. We construct our own container, render our component with it, and write assertions against it. But wait, there's more. Let's add a new feature to our app. Let's add an input where we can adjust the amount that our counter increments by. So if our amount is 5, our counter will go up by 5 as we increment it. So we'll create a new container for storing and updating the state of this amount. And then we'll create an amount component which subscribes to our container and renders an input to display and update it. And then back in our component, we can subscribe to both our counter container and our amount container at the same time, and we'll get instances of both. Internally, provider holds on to all the instances of our containers and shares them with the rest of our app. So these are two totally irrelevant components, and that one instance gets between them just sort of magically, but also very quickly. Just by referencing the container classes in both of our components, we get those shared instances of both. And yeah, that's the entire library. You are now an expert in it. So you're welcome. Of course, because it's a JavaScript library, I had to buy a .io domain. It's just going to bring you to the GitHub repo. It was a really good use of $65. And you can install the Unstated package in your app now. That's my talk.